The question was simple: what about the army?
As for things like tanks, small arms, armored personnel carriers, and artillery, that of course was coming to us in small amounts. And that was both officially and unofficially.
If it weren't for the volunteers at that time, it would have been harder for us too, but we knew that it was our land and why we were doing this in the first place.
From a huge but unwieldy Soviet machine through complete decline to the status of one of the strongest armies in the world, the Ukrainian military, now the main guarantor of our state's independence, has undergone a series of complex metamorphoses over these 35 years. And this path began with forced downsizing. After all, by 1991, the number of troops stationed in Ukraine reached 1 million people.
A figure absolutely inconsistent with the situation that existed in Ukraine. Well, 1 in every 50 people in the army for a state moving in a democratic direction. And of course, they began to reduce the size of the army.
It was a legacy of the Soviet era with all the statutes, doctrines, and the military that existed. And the main task back then was to essentially create a Ukrainian army, not just armed forces.
Already 2 years later, the parliament officially approved a resolution to reduce the number of military personnel by half. But here, another problem arose, a national one. After all, the USSR had disappeared, but Russians remained in leadership positions. A striking example is the situation with the Black Sea Fleet.
While the personnel was predominantly made up of Ukrainians, the high-ranking officers were Russians who didn't want to see any, cockles on their noble ships. And this led to a situation where a full-scale war could have started between us and Russia in July 1992, when one of the Black Sea Fleet's cutters raised the blue and yellow flag and headed to Odessa to the port.
Eventually, the fleet was divided. All the best ships, repair yards, and the most modern weaponry went to Russia. Ukraine felt like a poor relative on its own land in Sevastopol. And then came the era of the decline in the prestige of a person in uniform and the total sale and theft of all military property and armaments, from ordinary assault rifles, ammunition, and even beds in barracks to airplanes, tanks, armored vehicles, and cannons. The confusion with documents during the collapse of the Soviet Union also contributed to this.
And our Ministry of Defense did not receive from Moscow, even these records regarding the transfer of the quantity of equipment and everything else. That is, at some point it became, as a matter of fact, they would count it in the unit or in the warehouse, and that's how much there was. And how much there was before that, no one could find out at that moment because there was no exchange of information with Moscow.
The total corruption of the first years of independence was also fueled by the poor financial support for military personnel who were looking for ways to earn money in order to survive. This continued into the 2000s, recalls Roman Kostenko, Secretary of the Parliamentary Committee on National Security.
I was actually serving in the army during that period from 2001 to 2008 before transferring to the Alpha Special Forces of the Security Service of Ukraine. Very low salaries. I remember that my salary as a platoon commander or company commander was enough to rent an apartment, and well, after that my parents would send me bags of food from the village so I could make it to the end of the month.
But the real peak of the destruction of the Ukrainian army occurred during the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych.
Yanukovych came to power. An absolute task was set to destroy the army as such. This led to the result that the Russians had so hoped for when they planned the invasion of our state's territory in 2014.
Under Putin's stooge Yanukovych, the number of personnel in the Ukrainian army was reduced even further, to 120,000 people as of 2013, and conscription for military service was abolished altogether. And the quality of this training back then, eyewitnesses recall, left much to be desired.
And we even had belts with the hammer and sickle on them. They were pulling them out of crates. They were stored somewhere in warehouses. And there were also belts like that, those straps, just like the ones they have on combine harvesters. They were Soviet. The supplies were so-so.
A soldier of the NGU Rubish Brigade with the call sign Makar did his conscript service in 2010. And apart from poor supplies, drill training, and guard duty, he can't recall anything else. In 2014, the policy of the Party of Regions became clear. Yanukovych was carrying out Putin's order to destroy the armed forces of Ukraine once and for all, so that there would be no one to resist Russian aggression. So when Putin started the war in Donbass in 2014, thousands of men had to take up arms in real combat. And then, Makar recalls, he realized the full scale of the crisis the army was in.
They were issuing metal helmets. The uniform was the kind that burns. Everything was just unpleasant. I mean, we probably looked more like security guards for some underpass than soldiers. Well, it was a bit like that. I'm looking through these photos now. It's so funny, really funny, what it was then and what it is now. Well, there's a huge difference.
Not to mention the equipment, of which only a handful out of tens of thousands were operational in 2014.
I remember the first BTRs when they were heading out to the blockade of Crimea. I was in Mykolaiv then. The BTRs of the 79th Brigade were marching out, and half of them stopped, some right after leaving the military unit, others along the way. Either the tires would delaminate or the engines would simply break down because nothing was being repaired. They were just sitting there being counted by quantity.
But despite the lack of quality equipment and coordinated command, the first wave of the invaders was successfully held back. And that was when Europe and the whole world heard about the Ukrainian volunteers.
In 2014, a very interesting paradox emerged, which is a phenomenon for our history, for European history. This is the volunteer movement. Essentially, we are talking about the fact that the army was filled with highly motivated people who took up arms even without taking an oath in order to defend Ukraine. And that's over 50 volunteer battalions, let me remind you.
Yes, through the efforts of volunteers and the support of volunteer organizations, it was possible to avoid a deep enemy breakthrough. The front stabilized in Donbass. And although we lost Donetsk and Luhansk, we recaptured Mariupol and significant territories. And the armed forces gained time to strengthen. Over the next 8 years, the size of the army increased to 250,000. The attitude towards providing for our defenders also changed.
What was changing is the attitude towards the army, its provision, the increase of the army, the restoration of brigade units. We recreated 4 commands, different ones, southern, northern, western, and eastern.
So when Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022, an unpleasant surprise awaited the enemy. The Second Army in the world faced unprecedented resistance. The armed forces of Ukraine of the 2022 model not only prevented the capture of Kyiv, but also conducted brilliant operations to liberate the Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions, as well as parts of the Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson regions.
Let's go!
For the first time since independence was declared, the total size of the army has once again approached the 1 million mark. But this million is already fundamentally different. The army has many young combat commanders who went through both Ilovaisk and Debaltseve, who liberated Mariupol and later the Kharkiv region or Kherson. We were waiting for you. We love you. We are praying for you.
Thank you so much.
Today, our fighters are professionally proficient with the latest equipment, from Leopard and Abrams tanks to Patriot systems and F-16 aircraft. And our defense forces, in clear coordination between the armed forces of Ukraine, the SBU, and the GUR, are conducting operations that have never been heard of in world history. Take the Spiderweb operation, for instance, where Ukrainians destroyed and damaged over 40 of the enemy's strategic bombers in a single special operation deep behind Russian lines. Our warriors are virtuosos at operating drones of any class, actively use ground-based robotic systems, strike enemy targets at distances of over 2,000 kilometers, and are constantly improving their skills and abilities. So it is quite logical that it is the Ukrainian defense forces that are currently guarding democracy for the whole world and are the most reliable guarantor of Ukraine's independence.
There are no such offices in the world like the ones we have. There are no such infantrymen in the world, no such soldiers in general, supply, logistics, artillery. There are no such people in the world. Our army is truly one of the top armies in the world. And not because of, but in spite of.
Yehor Romklu, Daniil Samsonov and Volodymyr Kovalenko. Fakty, ICTV, Marathon. United News.